Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Cutting Room Floor. I thought I'd do something a little bit different today. Normally we look at some part of the sermon, that recent message here at Sunny Slope that maybe we just didn't get enough time to really fully dig into and explore. But I thought I'd try something a little bit different here, and that is to talk about to maybe talk about the difference between two different kinds of apologetics. We've been spending the summer looking at apologetics, or how does a person give an answer for the claims of the Christian faith. And it occurred to me that field of study is called apologetics. It's learning to give a defense. But what you might not know is that there are actually two main approaches to apologetics. And it's not that one is the right approach and the other is the wrong approach. It's really more that these are two different tools that you can use depending on the conversation that you're having, depending on the person that you're engaging, depending on a whole lot of different situations. And so I thought I'd maybe just outline a couple of them and give maybe a couple of examples, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how to engage people. The first is what is sometimes called evidentiary apologetics, and really that's in some ways that's the more well-known form of apologetics. At least some of the more recent books that have been written follow that approach. So you'd be looking at books like The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. You'd look at like More Than a Carpenter by I believe that's Josh McDowell. Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Those are books that essentially work with the evidence that is out there to try to demonstrate that the claims of the Christian faith are plausible and reasonable to believe. So, for example, evidentiary apologetics would say, well, let's look at the evidence that there is for the resurrection. And then you look at things like, well, there were eyewitness accounts that we have, and you then would try to lay out the fact that Jesus visited with 500 people after his death, and he saw Mary and Martha, and you look at all of those different little pieces of evidence, and you try to put them all together, and you try to evaluate, are these claims plausible? Are they reasonable? And if so, you end up building the case that indeed Jesus did rise from the dead. Or, for example, you look at the claim of miracles. Is it plausible, or is it possible that Jesus did miracles? And you look at the evidence. You look at, is there any historical evidence for it? Is there any precedent for it? And you sort of evaluate each of these claims from at least a philosophical or logical point of view, and you try to understand the evidence that supports a claim. And you can do that for a lot of different things. You can so you can look at the evidence. Was there a man that existed from Nazareth called Jesus? Is there any historical evidence? Are there any references that are made by other people, other historical figures? What about the validity or the truth of Scripture? Is there any evidence that Scripture is trustworthy? And so you look at the age of Scripture, you look at the manuscripts that we have available, you look at all the little pieces of evidence that support the authenticity and the trustworthiness of Scripture. You might look at archaeological evidence. You might look at is there historical and archaeological evidence that supports some of the stories and the events that are named in Scripture. And the goal in evidentiary apologetics is really is what it sounds like. You're gathering evidence, and you're working almost like a journalist or an investigator, and you're trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together in order to show that it's more reasonable than not that the claims of the Christian faith are truthful and are real. Now, the second form of apologetics is what's known as presuppositional apologetics. This is a method that's favored by people like Tim Keller or C.S. Lewis or Cornelius Van Til, who's a lesser known name today, but was in some ways is sort of the pioneer of much of this. Presuppositional apologetics, really, you have to sort of think of it like a Trojan horse approach to apologetics. What presuppositional apologetics does is it digs into the claims of the person, of the other person's worldview, and it tries to explore the presuppositions or the assumptions that are baked into that worldview, and it tries to show how those assumptions are contradictory and therefore not tenable. And then in turn, it tries to show how Christianity offers a better alternative. So let me give you an example of presuppositional apologetics. A person today might be making the claim that God is a God who should be loving and accepting and should never send a person to hell, that God should just kind of love everyone. Now, presuppositional apologetics would look at that claim and say, well, what you're really trying to do, if you take this position, you are trying to make God to be more, to sound more loving. You're trying to sort of take away the edges from a God that sends people to hell, and that's a claim that offends modern sensibilities. And so what you're really trying to do is you're trying to remove that claim, and you're doing it because you want the idea of a God who is more loving and more tolerant and more accepting. Now, if you're presuppositional apologetics, you're actually going to affirm something about that. You're going to say, you know what, there's something good about that. There's something right about the desire to magnify the goodness and the love of God. But then what you need to do is you challenge the underlying assumption. You say, in taking away the justice of God and taking away the claims that God actually punishes evil, you're ending up with a God not who's more loving and not who's more tolerant and more accepting, but you're actually ending up with a God who's very blasé because he simply accepts everyone. He's actually very tolerant and very open and very acceptable of evil and injustice and violence in this world. And so presuppositional apologetics will attack that underlying assumption. It will say, well, you're trying to create a God who's very loving and open and accepting, but instead what you end up with is a God who's very accepting and very tolerant of evil and violence and injustice. And so the Christian worldview, as difficult as it might seem at first, offers a view of God, and it holds to a view of God that actually, admittedly, on the face of it is challenging, because it actually calls us to embrace a God who does pass judgment, but that judgment reflects the fact that he hates evil, and he hates violence, and he hates injustice, and he intends to do something about it. And so then the Christian worldview actually offers a view that says the problem is not that evil and violence and injustice are all problems out there, but actually they're also within me as well. And so then I am just as much deserving of judgment and hell as anybody else, and yet through Christ I receive and I experience God's mercy and forgiveness. And so I can't claim moral high ground over anybody, but I can recognize that God has made a way to spare me and to spare others from the judgment that we all deserve. So that's a little bit how presuppositional apologetics works. You've got to think of it like a Trojan horse. You think of it like you're burrowing into someone else's worldview, and you're trying to expose the underlying assumptions and the underlying ideas, and you're doing that in order really to sort of dismantle their worldview from the inside, to kind of pull it apart so that it starts to implode, and then you hold up Christianity as a more plausible alternative. So how do you, and by the way, C.S. Lewis does this really well. C.S. Lewis also points to things like our longing for beauty and for justice and for relationship. N.T. Wright does this as well. And he points to those things, both Wright and Lewis point to those things as signposts that show us that our deepest longings and hopes and desires are ultimately satisfied in the gospel. And so you learn what you learn to do if you're practicing presuppositional apologetics. You actually learn to point people to the Christian faith as the most satisfying worldview. Which approach do you take? It all depends on the person that you're speaking with. If you are engaging with a person who needs to be convinced that the claims of the Christian faith are logical and reasonable, then you need to have in your toolbox, you need to be able to go to the evidence that supports the claims of the resurrection and the miracles and the historicity of Jesus and the historicity of Scripture. But you might be engaging with someone who actually entirely rejects the Christian worldview altogether and wants nothing really to do with it. And so then it's handy to have in your toolkit, it's handy to have a tool that can say, well, let's look at your worldview. Let's take it for granted that your worldview is true. What are the problems inherent in it, and how does it fail to really answer the deep questions and longings that we all have? Hey, thanks for watching. This has been another episode of The Cutting Room Floor, and we'll see you the next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe.